It was late in 2016, just a few months after my wife and I had moved into a new place in a bustling city, far from the quiet of suburban life we were used to. At that time, we were trying to pull ourselves out of a rough patch. I had just completed a 9-month stint in jail for some dubious financial choices, leaving us financially and emotionally drained. Legal fees and fines had eaten up most of our savings, so when it came time to find a new home close to our new jobs in downtown, our options were limited. We settled on a boarding house that fit our strained budget, offering weekly payments without the hefty demands of a security deposit. The house itself was modest, a slightly worn building with 4 rooms divided among the tenants, sharing a common kitchen and bathroom. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. The tenants were a mixed bunch. On the first floor lived a 30-year-old woman and her mother. Upstairs, there was a young guy who moved in the same week as us, and next to him, a young couple, Jim and Sierra, who quickly became the only people in the house we really talked to. They were about our age, shared our love for the occasional joint, and seemed to be the kind of easygoing, friendly neighbors you'd hope for in a place like this. For the first couple of months, everything was fairly normal. We'd bump into Jim and Sierra on the front porch, share a smoke, and chat about trivial things like work or the weather. It was casual and friendly, a welcome respite from the stress of our daily lives. But as November rolled around, the atmosphere started to change. It began with small things. We'd overhear Jim and Sierra arguing. At first, it was just raised voices behind closed doors, nothing too alarming. But then the arguments became more frequent and more intense. Soon, they began asking us for favors, borrowing money, asking for cigarettes, a few too many times. It was uncomfortable, but we tried to brush it off as just another quirk of close quarters living. One evening, I returned home to find Sierra entering the house with 3 men I didn't recognize, carrying a case of beer. They partied all night, the sound of their laughter and music bleeding through the thin walls, keeping my wife and I up until the early hours of the morning. We were irritated, sure, but life in a boarding house seldom affords the luxury of silence. The real breaking point came on a Sunday, our only day off. I was jolted awake by the sound of Jim's voice, louder and more aggressive than I had ever heard it. He was in the front yard, screaming at Sierra, throwing her belongings out onto the lawn. The tirade was vicious and filled with hurtful words that made me cringe. They argued back and forth for hours until finally, someone picked Sierra up. That week, the house was eerily quiet. Sierra was gone, and Jim kept to himself. My wife and I hoped that perhaps this was the end of the drama. However, peace was short-lived. Sierra moved back in the following week, and the cycle of fights resumed with even greater intensity. The situation escalated further the night before my birthday. After a long day at work, my wife and I settled in for a low-key evening. Around 1 a.m., we smoked some weed and put on a movie, trying to unwind. But the background noise of Jim and Sierra's latest argument was hard to ignore. They were right above us, and the sound of their angry voices and stomping feet filled our apartment. Eventually, the noise died down, and we took the opportunity to try and get some sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I was startled awake by my wife shaking me. Half asleep, I thought she might be worried about a bug or something trivial, but when I turned to see what had alarmed her, my heart stopped. There, beside our bed, stood a man. He was hunched over my nightstand, rifling through my drawer, holding an empty milk gallon. As I rolled over, we locked eyes. It was Jim, looking as shocked to see me as I was to see him. As I sat up in bed, my mind raced to make sense of the scene before me. Jim, still holding the empty milk gallon, began backing away slowly. The unexpectedness of the situation left me momentarily stunned, but I managed to gather my thoughts enough to confront him. "What's up, Jim? Why the hell are you in our room, bud?" I asked, my voice a mix of confusion and annoyance. After a brief pause, Jim stammered, "Can I borrow your guy's car, man? Or can one of you take me down to the gas station and back real quick?" His request, coming at such an absurd and inappropriate moment, only added to the surreal nature of the encounter. My wife, now fully awake and as incredulous as I was, cut in sharply. "What? You broke into our room to borrow our car?" "No, you cannot borrow our car after you broke into our room at 4 a.m. Now get the hell out of here, you freaking weirdo." Surprisingly, Jim didn't argue or resist. Instead, he sprinted out the front door and started running down the street toward the gas station he had mentioned. The abruptness of his departure left us in a stunned silence. Before we could even discuss what had just happened, our neighbor from upstairs came rushing down, his expression grave. He quickly explained that he had never heard or seen Jim and Sierra fight as badly as they had that night. He added that it had been quiet for about an hour since their last outburst. Concerned, especially given the violent history of their arguments, my wife urged me and our neighbor to check on Sierra. We hesitated at their door, the stillness of the hallway amplifying our anxiety. I knocked and called out, but there was no response. With a mutual look of apprehension, my neighbor and I slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The scene inside was chaotic. The room was in disarray, with signs of a struggle evident. Sierra was lying on the couch, facing upward, and the room was eerily silent. As we approached, the grim reality of the situation unfolded before us. There were splatters of blood on the walls, and the floor and ceiling appeared as though someone had been trying to hack through them. Reaching Sierra, the severity of the scene hit us fully. Blood was smeared across the couch and walls, and it was clear that she had been brutally attacked. My initial shock gave way to horror as I realized that her injuries were severe, her face nearly unrecognizable. My neighbor, who had already dialed 911, relayed to the dispatcher that Jim had likely attacked Sierra with a sledgehammer, which was still lying nearby. The dispatcher instructed us to leave the room and wait outside if we felt safe. As we stepped back into the cool night air, the gravity of what had occurred weighed heavily on us. The police arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the quiet of the early morning. They secured the scene and began their investigation. An APB was immediately put out for Jim. We learned later from the officers that it appeared Jim had been trying to access the gas lines, likely planning to burn down the house with Sierra inside. The thought that we had narrowly avoided an even greater tragedy chilled me to the bone. After the police had taken Jim into custody, the morning turned into a blur of flashing lights and hushed conversations. News vans arrived, and reporters hovered, eager for a story. My wife and I declined to speak with them, overwhelmed by the night's events and the stark reality of living so close to such violence. Reflecting on it all, I realized how fragile our sense of security really was. We had moved into this boarding house hoping for a fresh start, only to find ourselves entwined in a horrific crime. It was a stark reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, often closer than we think. The incident left a lasting impact on us. We became more cautious, more aware of our surroundings, and deeply appreciative of the quiet normalcy of days without incident. While we eventually moved to a better place, the lessons from that night remained with us, shaping our decisions and our perspectives on life and safety in profound ways. Growing up in a quaint neighborhood in the heart of Colorado, I was accustomed to the serene, predictable rhythms of suburban life. Houses lined up neatly, lawns trimmed to perfection, and neighbors who greeted each other with warm, albeit sometimes superficial, smiles. But amid this idyllic setting, there was one figure who stood out, not for his neighborliness, but for the undercurrent of unease that seemed to ripple around him. Mr. Harrow, as we'll call him, became the epicenter of a slow-brewing storm that had everyone on edge. Mr. Harrow's house, situated just down the street from mine, boasted the most meticulously maintained lawn I'd ever seen. An emerald expanse that never bore a single weed or an out-of-place blade of grass. The rumors were that he'd fire any landscaping crew that didn't meet his exacting standards on the first mistake, and from what I'd personally witnessed, he wasn't a man you wanted to cross. His outbursts at the landscapers weren't just loud, they were legendary. The incident that really cemented Mr. Harrow's reputation in our community occurred last summer and involved a local teenager, Tommy, who lived a few houses down. Tommy was a good kid, known around the neighborhood for his polite demeanor and willingness to lend a hand. So, when Mr. Harrow asked him to look after his house while he was on vacation, Tommy agreed without hesitation. But what seemed like a simple favor quickly devolved into something out of a psychological thriller. The day the Harrows left for their trip, Tommy received a detailed list of duties that went far beyond reasonable. Mr. Harrow demanded that Tommy visit the house multiple times a day to turn lights on and off at specified intervals using a stick with a loop on it from the doorway, so as not to step inside or tarnish the immaculate floors. He was instructed not to walk on the lawn and to remove his shoes before walking on the sidewalk. More bizarrely, Tommy was told to water the lawn with a tiny watering can, not the hose, a task as time-consuming as it was absurd. But the real kicker was the implication of surveillance. Mr. Harrow's note sternly advised Tommy that he would be watched, and that there would be consequences for any deviation from the instructions. Understandably, Tommy's parents were alarmed and decided to cancel the arrangement, opting instead to just keep a casual eye on the house. This decision sparked a heated phone argument with Mr. Harrow, who seemed more incensed about losing control over his meticulous plans than about the house sitting itself. When Mr. Harrow returned from his vacation, the confrontation escalated. He stormed over to Tommy's house early in the morning, banging on the door and demanding to speak with Tommy's parents. The commotion was enough to draw the attention of several neighbors, including retired Colonel Jenkins, who tried to mediate the increasingly tense situation. In a bizarre twist, Mr. Harrow suggested that a proper punishment for the perceived betrayal would be for him to administer a physical reprimand to Tommy himself, a suggestion that was met with horrified refusals. This incident could have been dismissed as an isolated case of bad temper, but it was just the beginning. Over the following months, Mr. Harrow's behavior grew increasingly erratic and threatening. Another neighbor encountered him at the local grocery store where Mr. Harrow, unprompted, launched into a half-hour tirade about the injustices he'd suffered at the hands of various community members. As whispers about Mr. Harrow's oddities turned into serious concerns, another disturbing pattern emerged. His wife, Mrs. Harrow, once a vibrant and sociable presence, had become virtually invisible. On rare occasions, she was seen tending to the flowers or retrieving the mail, but her interactions were brief and her demeanor subdued. This noticeable change in her behavior, combined with her husband's growing volatility, sparked worries that perhaps not all was well within the Harrow household. Then, one icy winter day, Mrs. Harrow was seen with a sling on her arm and a bruise around her eye. When a concerned neighbor inquired about her injuries, Mr. Harrow quickly interjected, explaining she had slipped on ice, and briskly ushered her back inside their home. Subsequent attempts to check on her well-being were met with closed doors and curt responses. The unease in our neighborhood reached a new height during a particularly harsh winter when Mr. Harrow took it upon himself to dictate community landscaping norms. Pamphlets from his preferred landscaping company were left in everyone's mailboxes with a note claiming that hiring his landscaper was now mandatory and that non-compliance would lead to legal action. A claim that was both unfounded and absurd, given our status as a community of private homes with no homeowners association. As the snow continued to fall that winter, Mr. Harrow's battle against perceived slights grew more intense. After a dispute about snow plowing, he scattered screws on the road, ostensibly to protest the snow being piled near his property. This act of defiance caused more than just logistical problems. It was a clear sign that Mr. Harrow was spiraling, and that his actions were becoming unpredictable and dangerous. As the chill of winter began to thaw into the early whispers of spring, the situation with Mr. Harrow didn't just simmer, it boiled over. Each incident seemed to escalate, further unraveling the fabric of what had once been a peaceful community. The climax came unexpectedly and was triggered by an incident that, under normal circumstances, might have been a cause for neighborhood celebration. The new family across the street, the Martins, had just gotten a puppy. A cheerful little beagle that quickly became the darling of the neighborhood kids. They had a secure backyard, perfectly fenced, where the puppy would spend its days romping joyfully. One night, however, their sense of security was shattered. The doorbell rang frantically at an ungodly hour. When Mr. Martin cautiously opened the door, he found Mr. Harrow standing at the edge of the property under the dim glow of the street lamp. The confrontation was surreal. Mr. Harrow, with a cold intensity, warned that if the puppy ever escaped the yard, it would be the last time they'd see it. Then, chillingly, he pulled out a gun, waved it around, and mockingly pointed it towards the backyard while saying bang. Terrified, the Martins retreated inside and immediately called the police. When confronted by law enforcement, Mr. Harrow's explanation was as bizarre as his behavior. He claimed he was merely out for a late-night walk and thought the Martins were still awake. He admitted to stopping by but denied ever pulling out a gun. He insisted that the bulge on his belt was benign and that his words were not meant as a threat. Despite his assertions, the police issued him a citation, a slap on the wrist that did little to ease the growing fears of the community. Spring brought no renewal for our neighborhood, only a deepening dread that permeated every interaction. Mr. Harrow took to sitting outside his house, glaring at passers-by and muttering under his breath. No one knew exactly what he was saying, but his hostile presence was enough to alter daily routines. I found myself, along with several others, taking long detours just to avoid driving past his house. Then, another disturbing event occurred, solidifying Mr. Harrow's reputation as a menace. A family down the street installed a swing set in their backyard for their 2 young children. They returned home one evening to a horrifying sight. Tire tracks leading up to their backyard and the swing set completely demolished, crushed under the weight of what appeared to be a deliberate act. While no one saw the incident occur, the tire tracks matched the unique tread of Mr. Harrow's oversized truck. The final straw for the community came when Colonel Jenkins, a retired military officer and a respected figure in the neighborhood, decided it was time to take action. He began compiling statements and documenting incidents involving Mr. Harrow. It was clear to him, as it was becoming to all of us, that something drastic needed to be done to ensure the safety and peace of our community. Meetings were held, often quietly and without public announcement, to discuss the collective anxiety and to strategize on the best way forward. Legal advice was sought, and the local police were consulted on a more regular basis. The community was on high alert, united by a common goal: to protect itself from the unpredictable threat that Mr. Harrow posed. In a twist that no one could have predicted, it was during one of these meetings that we learned Mrs. Harrow had finally reached out for help. She had contacted a local women's shelter, looking for a way out of her increasingly dangerous situation. This action was a poignant reminder of the hidden battles that were being fought behind closed doors and of the courage it took to seek escape. As summer approached, the tension remained, a palpable force that hung heavy over our once tranquil neighborhood. We all understood that we were on the brink, that any further provocation could lead to a confrontation none of us wanted. Yet, there was a collective resolve, a determination to stand together and protect our community, our families, and our way of life from the darkness that had descended upon us. Growing up in what most would call a cult was as normal to me as going to Sunday school is for others. It's not until you step back and view it through the lens of the outside world that you realize just how unusual your life has been. I'm here to share my story, not just to recount the peculiarities of my upbringing, but to shed light on the complexities of belief, belonging, and identity. My early childhood was spent deeply embedded in the teachings of a religious movement centered around a man many believed was the second coming of Christ. This man, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, a Korean leader who claimed to have been visited by Jesus at the age of 16 atop a mountain, was tasked with establishing the ideal family structure to model for the world. His mission was clear: create a blueprint for families that would lead to a utopian society on Earth. This ideology was drilled into us from an early age. We were taught about the restoration of the fall, a concept that suggested humanity needed to be cleansed of its original sins, not just forgiven. This cleansing was an active process, requiring us to engage in what the church called spiritual indemnities. These were acts meant to correct the course of human history, involving anything from intense fasting to physical hardships, like selling religious paraphernalia for long hours under harsh conditions. I spent countless days in a van, traveling with others, peddling everything from candles to wind chimes from dawn till dusk. The church controlled every aspect of our lives, including marriage. All contact with the opposite sex was forbidden until you were matched in an arranged marriage by the reverend or, in later years, by your own parents. This was seen as a critical step in overcoming human desires and adhering strictly to divine command. The marriages were termed blessings, believed to be the ultimate tool in restoring humanity to its original sinless state. In addition to personal sacrifices, we were expected to contribute financially to the church's cause. Money offerings were frequent and for varied purposes, from funding church activities to liberating ancestors from hell, a concept borrowed with a twist from traditional beliefs. The church had a particular fixation on Japan, charging Japanese members exorbitant fees for these liberations, while American members like myself paid significantly less, though still a hefty sum. Our daily life was filled with rituals. Every morning, regardless of personal circumstances, we performed hundreds of bows to a picture of Reverend Moon. We took cold showers and fasted regularly, preparing ourselves for marriage with a 7-day fast, believed to purify us completely. But the strangest ritual came each year on my birthday. Before the sun even hinted at rising, my family and I would gather at our home's altar dedicated to Reverend Moon. We prayed, offered food, and at the end of the ritual, I, as the birthday child, would distribute the food to my family members, always leaving a portion on the altar, a symbolic offering to ensure blessings for the coming year. The narratives fed to us were filled with tales of dire consequences for those who dared to leave the fold. Stories circulated of former members meeting tragic ends shortly after breaking away, reinforcing the peril of existing outside the church's protective reach. These stories were meant to instill fear, binding us tighter to the church and its teachings. Life in the church wasn't just about following strict rules. It was framed as a divine mission. We weren't merely members of a religious group. We were chosen soldiers in a spiritual battle to save the world. This messianic mission was compelling, especially to those of us born into the church, often referred to as second-generation members. We were considered as pure as Jesus, born without original sin, and destined to lead the world into a new era. The leaders, predominantly Korean, maintained a tight grip on the church's direction and teachings. Despite its global message of unity and reconciliation of world cultures and religions, leadership positions were reserved for Koreans, emphasizing Korea as the new Jerusalem and Koreans as the new chosen people. As I grew older and began to question the constraints and contradictions of my upbringing, I realized the extent of the church's manipulation. It exploited its members' desires for spiritual fulfillment and community, intertwining these with excessive control over personal and financial aspects of their lives. These realizations led me to a crossroads, forcing me to decide whether to continue on this path laid out since my birth or to step into the unknown and forge a new way of life based on my own beliefs and values. As this part of my story concludes, it's clear that my journey was about to take a dramatic turn, challenging everything I had been taught to believe. In the next part, I will delve into the process of breaking away, the challenges of redefining identity, and the eventual liberation from the all-encompassing grip of the church. The process of questioning and eventually breaking away from the church was a gradual awakening. Each doubt like a crack in a dam, holding back years of suppressed curiosity and skepticism. As I entered my late teens, the world outside the church's walls began to seep into my consciousness, bringing with it a flood of forbidden knowledge and alternative perspectives. It started innocuously enough, with books, internet articles, and interactions with people outside the church during my brief outings into the broader community. One pivotal moment came during a community service project outside our insular world. Working alongside people of various backgrounds and beliefs, I was struck by the genuine kindness and morality displayed by those who had never known, or needed, the strict doctrines of my upbringing. They were good, honest people, not driven by fear of divine retribution, but by a simple, intrinsic desire to do good. This realization was jarring, directly contradicting the church's teachings that morality was inextricably linked to our specific religious practices. Conversations with my peers at school further fueled my burgeoning doubts. I listened, often in silence, absorbing their views on religion, spirituality, and ethics. Their freedom to question and criticize, to openly discuss and disagree, was intoxicating. It was a stark contrast to the rigid, predetermined answers provided by the church. The more I learned, the more the ideological foundations of my childhood began to crumble. My doubts turned to conflicts, both internal and with my family. I started to voice my questions at home, challenging the justifications given for our practices. These confrontations were painful. My parents, deeply entrenched in their beliefs, saw my questions as attacks, not just on the church, but on them personally. They responded with everything from disappointment to anger and stern warnings about the consequences of straying from the path. Yet, despite the growing tension at home, I couldn't stop my quest for truth. It felt like a vital part of me was waking up, a part that had been dormant, sedated by years of indoctrination. I began to secretly connect with former members, those who had been ostracized and demonized by the church. Their stories of life outside the church, of recovery and newfound happiness, were both terrifying and inspiring. They spoke of the initial hardships, the struggle to redefine their identities and find community, but also of the profound peace and freedom they eventually found. The final straw came when the church introduced a new ceremony, holy wine ceremony that promised absolution from all sins for a hefty fee. It was blatantly exploitative, and something about the brazenness of this new scheme made everything click into place for me. I could no longer deny the manipulation and greed that drove much of the church's leadership. Making the decision to leave was one thing. Executing it was another. I knew that once I left, my relationship with my family might never recover. I would also be leaving behind the only community I had ever known, stepping out into a world that was still largely unfamiliar and daunting. I left quietly, without dramatic confrontations. I moved to a city far from any church community, took a job, and enrolled in night classes at a community college. The first year was the hardest. I struggled with loneliness and guilt, haunted by the ingrained fear of divine retribution. But as time passed, I built a new life, one defined by my choices and beliefs. I found friends who became a new kind of family, one chosen by love and mutual respect rather than dictated by doctrine. Looking back, the journey from where I started to where I am now seems almost surreal. I've gone from a world where every aspect of life was controlled to one where freedom and self-expression are my guiding principles. The transition was not easy, and the scars from my past will always be a part of me. However, these scars are also a testament to my strength and resilience. Today, I use my experiences to help others who might be facing similar challenges. I volunteer with organizations dedicated to supporting those leaving high-control groups. Sharing my story, I hope to offer a beacon of hope and a reminder that while the journey is difficult, it is also incredibly rewarding. Each of us has the power to redefine our path, to break free from the past, and to forge a future based on our own values and dreams. This story, my story, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the quest for truth, and the pursuit of genuine freedom. Growing up in a small town, the kind without bus service for kids living within the town limits, meant my older brother Jake and I walked to school each day. It was a good half-hour trek, a routine that forged many memories, especially because of the big, old Victorian house we passed along the way. That house became the centerpiece of numerous tales and childhood fears, largely thanks to Jake's affinity for scaring me at every opportunity. Jake was 2 years my senior, a gap that made him both my tormentor and my protector in the strange hierarchy of sibling relationships. As much as I disliked being scared, I have to admit, I was no better when it came to trying to spook our younger siblings. But that's kids for you. A little hypocritical but all in good fun, right? The house in question looked exactly like what you'd imagine a haunted house to be. It hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The lawn was a patchwork of dead grass, and the only decorations were a decayed tire swing and a collection of broken bikes and tricycles that littered the backyard. An old, rusty shed squatted ominously among the debris, completing the picture of desolation. Despite the eerie desolation, we never saw anyone enter or leave the house, which somehow made it all the more mysterious and frightening. However, in the evenings, a faint blue light would glow behind the curtains, suggesting that someone was watching TV in the dark, alone. Every time we walked by that house, Jake would weave elaborate, terrifying stories about the occupant, a butcher, according to his imagination, who had a penchant for preying on neighborhood kids. He'd describe in vivid detail how the old man would lure unsuspecting children to his shed, hang them by their feet, and use a fine knife to, well, the gruesome details Jake conjured up would make my blood run cold. I was only 12 and quite easily scared, despite my best efforts to appear unfazed. Jake's favorite pastime, it seemed, was daring me to test these tales by performing acts of minor vandalism, like breaking one of the old flower pots that cluttered the porch. I always refused, not out of belief in his stories, but because I didn't want to get in trouble for real. Of course, this only earned me the label of scaredy cat, a tag I despised but tolerated. As Halloween approached the year I turned 12, I found myself roped into a different kind of celebration. Instead of the usual trick-or-treating, Jake invited me to join him and his friends for some adolescent mischief, which involved egging houses and the classic prank of lighting flaming bags on doorsteps. It was supposed to be a night of harmless fun, a rite of passage into the world of teenage rebellion. However, as the night wore on, the group decided it was time for the newbie, me, to prove my mettle. They dared me to face the old Victorian house alone and execute the long-feared pot-breaking challenge. Despite my desire to fit in, my fear of the actual house and its supposed occupant outweighed my need for acceptance. I flatly refused, enduring the wave of taunts and jeers that followed. The teasing escalated until, in a moment of anger, I threw the challenge back at Jake. I hadn't planned to. It just slipped out in my frustration. But suddenly, the focus shifted. Jake, caught off guard and now under pressure from his friends, couldn't back down without losing face. With a mix of bravado and clear apprehension, Jake strode up to the house. I could tell he was scared. His usual confident swagger was replaced by a hesitant, rigid posture. But he went ahead, lifted a pot above his head as if claiming victory over his fears, when suddenly the front door creaked open. A huge, shadowy figure emerged from the darkness of the house, stepping quietly up behind Jake. My heart stopped. Even from a distance, the man's presence was intimidating. Jake's friends, true to their nature, chose that moment to flee, shouting half-hearted warnings as they disappeared into the night. But I couldn't leave. Not when my brother was in danger. Frozen with fear yet driven by a surge of adrenaline, I watched as the situation unfolded in slow motion. The large man moved stealthily behind Jake, who remained oblivious until the last moment, thinking his friend's shouts were just another attempt to scare him. But as Jake turned around and saw the man, the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. The pot fell from his hands and shattered on the porch with a loud crash, adding a surreal soundtrack to the nightmare unfolding before us. The man was enormous, towering over Jake, and before my brother could react, he was grabbed around the neck in a vice-like grip. Jake struggled, his feet barely touching the ground, his face turning red then purple as he gasped for air. My brother's so-called friends had already scattered into the night, their loyalty dissipating faster than their laughter. But I couldn't run. Not from this. Not from Jake. Without thinking, I dashed up the steps, my young mind racing through every possible scenario except the one that was happening. As I approached, the man swatted at me, his other arm still locked around Jake's neck. His strength was overwhelming, and the situation was desperate. I knew I had to do something drastic to break his grip on my brother. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I aimed a kick squarely at the man's groin. The impact made him flinch, but he didn't release Jake. I kicked again, harder this time, and then again. After the sixth kick, fueled by panic and a fierce desire to save my brother, the man finally let go, releasing a groan of pain as he doubled over. Jake fell to the ground, coughing and wheezing, struggling to draw breath into his bruised throat. I didn't pause to consider our next move. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him to his feet. "We need to get out of here," I gasped, more terrified than I had ever been in my life. Together, we stumbled away from the porch, half running, half dragging each other down the street, not stopping to look back until we were several blocks away, and the menacing silhouette of the Victorian house was nothing but a shadow against the night sky. Once home, we burst through the front door, our appearance and demeanor shocking enough to immediately alert our parents that something was terribly wrong. Between gasps, Jake managed to recount the story, and I filled in the gaps as best I could. Horrified and furious, our parents called the police, insisting they take action against the man who had attacked us. However, the response was frustratingly inadequate. The police were hesitant to pursue the matter aggressively, citing Jake's initial act of vandalism and the difficulty of pressing charges against the homeowner for defending his property, despite the excessive nature of his response. It felt like a twisted version of justice, where the lines between self-defense and assault blurred under the law's indifferent gaze. Our parents were outraged by the lack of police action, but decided it was best to avoid further confrontation. From that day forward, they drove us to and from school, taking a longer route to avoid passing the Victorian house. The incident left a scar on our little community, on our sense of safety, and on the brotherly bond between Jake and me. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. Jake didn't speak much about what happened, but the incident had changed him. He was more subdued, less prone to the reckless daring that had characterized so much of his behavior before that night. And while it took a while for our relationship to return to some semblance of normal, about 2 months before he started playfully teasing me again, I knew we had both grown from the experience in ways we couldn't yet fully understand. That Halloween night, marked by fear and forged in desperation, brought us closer together. It taught us about the strength we had as brothers, the power of standing up for one another, and the harsh realities of the world that awaited us outside the protective bubble of childhood. Though we would go on to face other challenges, both together and apart, the memory of that night remained a pivotal chapter in our lives, a reminder of the bond that no amount of fear could break. When I was 16, my life was a whirlwind of typical teenage angst, dreams, and the occasional drama that felt monumental. I was navigating high school with the usual mix of excitement and trepidation, but I was blissfully unaware of a peculiar disturbance that had started to unsettle my dad. It began with the phone calls. They always came in the dead of night, the kind of late hour when the world is hushed and even the nocturnal creatures seem to be in repose. My dad, a stalwart figure who rarely showed fear or frustration, was the one who always answered. The caller would demand to speak with me, his voice dripping with malice and impatience. And when my dad, standing his ground, informed him that I was asleep, the caller would unleash a torrent of vile and repulsive remarks about me. Remarks that no parent should ever have to hear about their child. My dad never let on the full extent of these calls at the time, sparing me the details perhaps to protect my innocence, or maybe to keep from worrying me unnecessarily. He would mention them casually, trying to downplay the severity, but I could see the shadow they cast on his usually calm demeanor. I was a sound sleeper back then, able to drift off without the weight of the world on my shoulders. I never once woke up to the ringing phone or the subsequent, venomous exchanges. Now, looking back, I wish I could sleep with that same carefree abandon, but such innocence has long been eroded by the sands of time and experience. 6 years later, fresh out of the military, I found myself back home in Maplewood, a quaint suburb that seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. The town hadn't changed much, but I certainly had. The military had sculpted me into a more disciplined, resilient person. I was gearing up for college, trying to balance a part-time job and saving money, all while readjusting to civilian life. It was during this time, when I had started to settle back into a routine, that I first heard the phone ring in the middle of the night. My dad, over breakfast one morning, mentioned offhandedly that the calls had tapered off while I was away. For 4 years, the nocturnal intrusions had ceased, but now, with my return, they had ominously resumed. One particularly uneventful day, around noon, the phone rang. I was at home, alone, the house quiet and filled with the kind of stillness that only midday can bring. I answered, expecting a telemarketer or perhaps a friend calling to catch up. Instead, a voice that I didn't recognize but felt an eerie familiarity with asked for me by name. "Speaking," I replied, curiosity and a hint of unease coloring my tone. The caller launched into a grotesque litany, describing sexual acts and other depraved scenarios with a level of detail that turned my stomach. I hung up abruptly, my hands shaking, heart pounding in my chest. All these years, I had imagined that if I could just hear the voice, I would know who it was. I thought it would bring clarity, but instead, it brought only confusion and fear. I called the police, recounting the years of harassment and the most recent disturbing encounter. They came to take my statement, their presence a temporary balm to my frayed nerves. This was just before caller ID became commonplace in our city, and they explained how I could trace the call next time. They gave me a case number, a small measure of control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. A year later, I moved into my own apartment, a small but cozy space that I took great pride in. It was a significant milestone, a symbol of my independence and new beginnings. I had my name listed in the phone book, a common practice before the rise of the internet, where being contactable felt essential. Several months passed without incident, and I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I was free from my anonymous tormentor. But one day, I came home to a message on my answering machine. The voice was unmistakable. "Hello, I think you know who this is." "Still," it said before the line went dead. A chill ran down my spine. I promptly requested an unlisted number and became one of the first people in Seattle to get residential caller ID. That message was the last I ever heard from him. For reasons unknown, the calls stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Life moved on, as it tends to do, and the strange chapter of midnight calls faded into the background of my memory. Yet, it left an indelible mark on me, a reminder of the unsettling mysteries that sometimes lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Despite the harrowing nature of those years, I emerged stronger, more vigilant, and deeply appreciative of the peace that eventually returned to my life. The calls had disrupted my family's tranquility and tested our resilience. But in the end, we found our way back to a semblance of normalcy. The experience, though dark, became a testament to our enduring spirit and the unyielding bonds of family. Now, I often reflect on those times with a mix of emotions. There's fear, certainly, but also a strange gratitude. Gratitude for the strength it forged in me, for the unwavering support of my dad, and for the quiet, uninterrupted nights that I no longer take for granted.